and you have an incredibly accessible style, and you have a very clear grip on what it is you're trying to say and an understanding of yourself and where you are in all of it. So it's not like I've got all the answers, and everything's perfect.
I definitely, if I ever start to say that, call me and say, because that's dangerous. That's dangerous. No, I just know what's worked for me.
Yeah.
That's all I'm saying. This is what I think, take it or leave it. But, and yeah, like what's really important to me is to take, like, whether it's talking about spirituality or veganism, which to me are this, like, but it's taking these bigger concepts and how do I bring them down to earth in a very kind of blue collar, direct, no bullshit kind of way, so that it's actually something you can practically apply. Because I know whether you're trying to transition to a vegan lifestyle or diet or whatever person calls it, or you're trying to incorporate daily spiritual practices, if you're not able to live it, this is not something we theorize about. This is being able to daily practical application. So that's what was most interesting to me, is I didn't want to sit around and fucking talk about it or theorize about it. I want to make it so that people can live it. And that's what's most exciting to me. So yeah, so this is really cool. So thank you so much. Anytime I can be in service, Friends Not Food, to my animal brothers and sisters, I'm so excited. And my human brothers and sisters.
And the other piece of it is because we have a very large content part of our website, we decided early on that we wanted to be as much about giving content as food, because we think it's important. We get too hung up on the about food, and they don't put it in the context of their life.
Yes.
And so this is something that I am really happy to promote what you're doing. I want to bring your message and you to our people. And I think it's important. So in whatever way we can do that, and that's really.
I'm really honored and happy to be here, and thank you I'm like, they like me, they picked me. No, but I appreciate you picking me. And then when it goes live, in launches, I'm more than happy, obviously, to do a shout out to my people and put it on social media and stuff like that too. So
cool. So why don't we begin? One thing that's always fascinated me about you is you have a really compelling life story. That is unique. You've had some very unique. Well, you've had unique experiences, and they're ones that unfortunately a lot of people don't have, because I think they were incredibly painful, and I think you've dealt with it in a way that is really useful for other people to hear. It seems like you had quite a journey to get where you are. So I wondered if you could speak to the events of your life that brought you to this piece, and especially early on when you were a young girl and lost your mom.
Yeah. So, I mean, the short version story of it is that my mother and my biological father got divorced when I was 2. I grew up in Lawrence, Massachusetts, which is like in Boston. It's like 30 miles north of Boston. It's a tough little city. It was an immigrant city right on the Merrimack River. And a bunch of blue collar kids basically like hanging out. And I always laugh because my dad was a Wonder Bread man. So I always jokingly say, like, I never had a piece of whole grain bread till I was in my 30s. Right? I was like, and I still to this day prefer, like, white bread, but good white bread, like sourdough, like, organic, whatever. But I laugh. So I come from a blue collar neighborhood and working class, and my parents got divorced when I was 2, and then my stepfather, who I consider my dad, came onto the scene when I was like 3. And my parents were really young. I mean, back then, like back in the 60s and early 70s, the babies were having babies. So my mother was like 18, 19, had me when she was 20. And it was like kids raising kids. And so I always say my parents were wicked smart. They were beautiful. They're beautiful to look at. They're wicked smart, but they were also really stupid when it came in terms of like paying the bills and like being responsible and like things like that. They both had good jobs, but we always seemed to like not have any money, and like the electricity would get shut off, blah, 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 blah. And like their communication style there was no communication. It was like 0 to 60. It went from like whatever would happen to screaming and yelling and somebody throwing a plate of food or like whatever the thing. And it was a war zone. It was crazy growing up as a kid. Doesn't mean that we didn't have like some fun, but it was eggshells. Like you just never knew what was going to happen. And so they would split up like all the time. And when I was 12 and my sister Kim was 13, about to turn 14, it was one of those periods where they were split up. And I think this was the one. This was like in May 1981. And they were split up, and I think this was it. They were going to get a divorce. My dad was living at my aunt's house. He was already dating somebody else. And my mother went out one night, and she just didn't come home. We woke up the next day. My mother was missing. My sister sent me to school, and by the time I came back from school around 3 p.m., still nobody had heard from my mother. And so my dad just showed up out of the blue. We hadn't seen him in a few months. And he just showed up out of the blue, and he sat us down, and he said, hey, look, I'm just going to tell you, your mother is dead. Like, that's it. That's how we found out. And we come to find out that she had been murdered. She was beaten to death, brutally kicked and punched to death beyond recognition. It was a horrible, violent, just brutal crime. And, you know, the police and the state police said they'd never seen anything like it. And it was just awful, awful, awful. And so that, as you can imagine, like, changed the whole trajectory of my life. And so that's what I would call, like, as a writer, because I'm also a writer and a gateless writing teacher, it kind of like what I would call the inciting incident, right? That kind of changed the whole trajectory of my life. And so from that point on, I said, what that really did is, like, my mother was the light of my world. She was like the sun to my solar system. I was 12 and I was a tomboy, so I hadn't tipped in yet into that crazy teenage girl thing. Wow. So my mother was still the love of my life, and I just adored her. And so it was like losing what I call my internal compass. And she was how I navigated the world. And I was a wicked shy kid. And like, I would used to mumble all the time. I couldn't look people in the eye, like whatever. And my mother was the one who just, she saw me. Like, my mother saw me, and she saw my sensitivity, and she saw my creativity, and she saw my intelligence, and she loved me. And she always used to, you know, they call it breathing life into a person. My mother breathed life into me all the time, that I could do whatever I wanted to do. And after she died, like, I didn't have that anymore. My whole life blew up. My dad didn't want us. He didn't want to take care of us. My biological father showed up. I didn't know who he was. I hadn't seen him since I was 2. He already at that point had a shit ton of kids. I have like a biological sister, 2 half brothers where we have same dads but different moms, and then I have like 20 stepbrothers and stepsisters. And just because of all the intermarriage things. And so it was just like a shit show, to call it what it was. And another aunt and uncle wanted to send us off to a boarding school, a Catholic boarding school in Rhode Island. And so we ended up going to live with an aunt and uncle that I didn't even know. And it was like moving in with strangers. So I lost my mother, I lost my house, I lost everything that was familiar except for like my sister. And we were never like, I always say it's one of those things where the way that my father raised us, you know, there was no room for any weakness. And it was like only the strong. So it was like being like, remember before Survivor came out, it was like Survivor. And so you were like looking out for number 1, right? There was no like, hey, let's team up to beat the whatever, the system, because there was no beating the system. So it was like every man surviving for himself. But then after my mother died, it was more like, we love each other. I think that we have an unbreakable bond, but we're not a natural fit, if that makes sense, right? We're really different, but certain things we're totally the same. Certain things we're like, we're really far apart. But I love my sister to death. But it was difficult. It was just hard, man. It was just wicked hard. And it made me feel, I was already probably anxious prone, because I was really sensitive, and I was hyper aware of my environment like all the time and what was happening. And so it actually has helped me as a spiritual mentor. It has helped me so much as a writer to be hyper observant. And the writer Henry James has a beautiful quote I love that says, try to be the kind of person upon whom nothing is lost. And so one of the ways that I sought comfort as a child always was through books and animals. And animals were like always my best friend. And I say that animals were always one of my fastest and least complicated pathways to God or to the divine or to spirit. And so I just, I just turned to books. Nobody in my family talked about my mother. She was found on a Thursday morning. Her body was found on a Thursday morning outside a pet cemetery in Methuen by the MSPCA. And so they found her on a Thursday morning at 11, and she was in the ground on Saturday by 11. And it was an open casket because she had been beaten so brutally. So it was just like when you're a 12-year-old kid and all of a sudden your mother was just gone. It was like she disappeared overnight, and it was really, really hard. And I suffered for a really long time. And so, but all that suffering is what taught me how to have deep, deep, deep compassion for other people suffering and for other beings suffering. And there's a particular moment, and we can talk about that later. There's a particular moment when I was looking at, when I made the choice. I've been, as you can see, my Friends Not Food shirt. I've been vegan for like, a little over 16 years. I was a vegetarian before that. And then I went in and made the commitment to, I'm not a vegan by diet. I'm vegan by lifestyle, like my whole life. I think there's a little bit of a difference. So those moments as a child really informs the work that I do in the world now and how I show up now and the choices and stuff that I make now. So sorry, no, long answer to a short question.
I mean, and having a daughter who we have that kind of, the relationship that you described, it just absolutely breaks my heart to think of what happened to her if I left. So I just think, that is an unbelievably difficult thing to go through.
How old is your daughter?
Thinking about it. She's 7 now.
Oh yeah, so yeah,
it's just, wow. So it always intrigues me, how do some people make it? What do they do? And how does that difficult thing happen, and then you find a way? And so one of the things that and I love about your work is that you're very practical. And so
yes.
I'd like to kind of just untangle that a little bit, because when you come from very difficult things, people can go down wrong paths for a long time just out of pain. What happened, or was there a moment or a series of moments when you began to think, or did you make a conscious choice, I'm not going to go in a bad direction if you did, or I'm going to choose a more spiritual path? I'm putting it that way, just kind of lightly.
Yeah. So, I mean, I always say, like, as a caveat, but I laugh when I say it. It's like I'm writing a memoir, so like all the details will be in there. But there's like three things that just kind of, that off the top of my head, I can kind of like, point to is, so I was raised Catholic. I was a Catholic kid. And interestingly enough, when that happened, what I see a lot of people from faith traditions do, or Catholic kids especially do, when something awful happens, they say, why did God do this? Why would God let this happen? And for whatever reason, I was just really clear that it was a man that had murdered my mother. It wasn't God's doing. Like I used to get mad, but not like at God. Does that make sense? I wasn't like raging. I might be like, why? Like, why? I just didn't understand. Yeah. And I was trying to make sense of a senseless action. So there was really no answer to it anyways. You know what I'm saying? And so I suffered for a really long time. And I did. I mean, I got drunk for the first time when I was 12, and like I started drinking and I started experimenting with drugs, and thank God, I just did a whole podcast episode on, let's talk about drinking. Like, thank God I didn't have an addiction gene. Like it just, I didn't get the gene. So I was able to dabble deeply. I shouldn't even call it dabble. I was able to imbue deeply with a lot of different substances, but I was always able to, I always had even if I wouldn't have called it my spiritual team or my inner teacher, I think there was always a voice somewhere deep inside of me that would break through every once in a while and say, you might want to be fucking careful, kid. Like, there are some things where I did some things and I was like, oh, that could have not ended well, type of a thing. Right. So I did. Not like I didn't. I lost my virginity too young. I smoked too young. I drank too young. Like, I just did it all because I was highly, in a lot of ways, and I hope, my family members hear this the way that I mean it, is that I was highly unsupervised. So I was doing a lot of stuff. Like, I put myself on the pill when I was like 13 years old, 14 years old. Like, I did it. I just walked into the clinic and was like, okay, I don't want to get knocked up. I see too much of that. So there's always a part of me that was kind of smart. You know what I mean? So that was very helpful. So because I was paying attention. I was paying, even though, whatever. So I was always like, I was smart. I was probably just smart enough to be dangerous. But anyway, so it's not like, oh, I was just always so spiritual. It's like, no. And then what happened is, what deepened that relationship and kind of pointed me more towards God is, I say when my mother died, when my mother just was like sucked from our lives, it was a big deal because it was like on the news and on the TV and the newspapers, but we weren't allowed to see any of that. So I just felt like everybody else was informed. And all I knew is my mother was just gone. And I said, when my mother left physically, it created a lot of space for the divine to enter in. So there was one time, you know, as Catholic kids, for those of you who might know, there's a thing called confession, right? Where you have to like go into the confessional and confess your sins. And so my aunt and uncle would like drop us off like to go to like confession on those days. And so it's like, this is kind of a creepy thing. Like there's this little box and you go in and it's like a spy movie. Like a guy in a black outfit like slides the thing and you can't really see his face. It's just like, what is going on? But anyway, so my sister was sitting right outside the confessional. And I went in and the guy slides the thing open and you're already, the fact that you have to admit that you're a sinner has never really resonated with me. But anyways, it's like, forgive me, Father. It's been this long since my last confession. This is what I did. I know I stole or I lied. I swore. I yelled at my sister, whatever. And I would equally say truthy things and I would lie, right? I would make shit up just to have stuff to say. And then at the end, they say there's a prayer and you're supposed to say the act of contrition, right? And here's the thing that I'm like, dude, like I was just months out of my mother being murdered. So I have no doubt now, like I didn't even realize I was traumatized. Recently, I'm 50 now, but recently a woman I'm working with said to me, you had trauma, like you had PTSD. And I was like, I did? Like, didn't even occur to me because I was such a tough kid. Like, I'm just going to get through this thing. But anyway, so I was still in shock, I am sure. And he's like, say the act of contrition. I couldn't remember it. And he started yelling at me.
Oh my goodness.
And he was like, you know, this whole thing. And then it's like, go up and say this many Hail Marys and this many, whatever the punishment was, right? And I just knew my sister could hear all this. And when I stepped out, she had this shit-eating grin on her face. And I was equally embarrassed and pissed.
Yeah.
I was so like, and so I remember walking up to the front of the church, St. Pat's in Lawrence. And I remember kneeling down and just looking up and there was Jesus strung up like whatever. And as I look at Mary holding the baby Jesus and I look up at Jesus and I say, this is it. I said, no more middlemen. I'm not doing this anymore. If we're going to talk, I'm talking to God. I'm like, if we're going to talk, we're going to do it right here.
Right.
I'm not doing this anymore. So at a very young age, I just was like, Brent, and it's not that I gave up the church. I still made my confirmation. I still went to church, but I just had a different relationship now. So I had access to something greater than me. And then probably like the last thing that happened is my mother started coming to me in dreams. And my mother started saying to me, and I'm getting to the point where you're like, was this one moment? So these were all these, there were many, but these are three that really pop out right now. My mom started coming to me in dreams and she said to me, speaking about the guy that killed her, she said, I've forgiven him. Now it's your turn. And I was like, ugh, because I grew up in an environment that was very much an eye for an eye.
Sure. Yeah.
No forgiveness happening. And if there was forgiveness, first of all, there was really no forgiveness. If somebody like betrayed you, like my Uncle Manny, I always tell the story. So my Uncle Manny, like in his 40s, got a tattoo of an eye on his shoulder, like an eyeball, right? And one day I said to him, I'm like, Uncle Manny, like, what's with the tattoo? Like, why did you get that tattoo? And he goes, so when the bastards try to stab me in the back, I see them coming. Right? It was like that kind of family, okay? There was no like forgiveness work going on. And so I didn't know how to forgive, or the only forgiveness that I knew was like this pious version of I'm better than you, so I'm going to like bequeath you like the queen, my pardon, right? I'm going to pardon you. I'm going to pardon you for being a dick or whatever you did, right? So I didn't really know how to forgive. And at that point, I was living out in California. And like I said, books and animals were always my savior. And so I couldn't have pets where I lived in this apartment in LA. I made no money. I had to take the bus everywhere. I was like, whatever. But I always went into bookstores. And one day I went into a bookstore and I was in the workout section because I was really into lifting and stuff like that. And all of a sudden I literally heard a very clear voice in my head say, you should go to the self-help section because you could use some help. And I was like, okay, like whatever. And so I went into the self-help section. Now, so this is like 92 or 93. I'm in Burbank. And this is when the self-help just blew up. Louise Hay, Deepak Chopra, Marianne Williamson, Iyanla Vanzant, like Tony Robbins, everybody had books coming out. So I'm walking down the self-help aisle. There's nobody, there's like stacks here and then tall stacks here. Nobody else is in the aisle. And all of a sudden this book like just fell off the shelf at my feet. It was like, yep. And so I looked down and it's A Return to Love by Marianne Williamson. And it's A Return to Love, Reflections on the Principles of A Course in Miracles. And I see the picture of her like on the cover, and I'm like, who's this broad? Like, I'll like, my whole thing is always like this. What's her fucking story? Like, what's her story, right? So I pick it up and I start to read it. And in that moment, it was the first time, like it was before Borders. There were no chairs anywhere. I just sat on the floor because I had no money to buy it. But I sat on the floor and I started to read it. And I always say I got equally pissed and inspired because nobody had ever talked about God, forgiveness, and choice this particular way. And so what I realized from reading this book, I eventually saved the money to buy it. And then, you know, then she was on Oprah, and that whole book and everything blew up, and A Course in Miracles and all these different things like took off. But I remember realizing that A Course in Miracles in this book, A Return to Love, taught me that, Marianne taught me that I was responsible for my own happiness. I was responsible for my own suffering, that I actually had a choice whether or not I suffered, that I was not at the mercy of the world, that I was not a victim unless I chose to be, that my mind was the cause, the world was simply the effect, that the world was simply an outward reflection of an inward condition. If I wanted to change anything, it had to happen in here. It taught me about forgiveness in a whole new way, and it was just like, it blew my mind. And so that was probably, I would say I had always been